You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to have quite the episode here today. I am excited to see where this one goes. We have a guest with us. We have the Dr. Andrew Hale. He has served in congregational life for over 25 years. He's been a denominational leader, consultant, church starter, pastor, coach, and organizational psychologist. He is currently the Associate Executive Coordinator of CBF North Carolina, a fellowship under the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. So we are really excited to have this conversation. Dr. Hale, thanks for being with us here today.
Colin, thanks for having me on. And, it really will be a testament to the work that I'm doing through this book and what I do, because you're a Phillies fan and I'm a lifelong New York Mets fan. So we're really, to see just how compassionate and inclusive I can be in this conversation.
Yeah, you're putting the book to work already, making sure we can agree. I will say it hasn't been the best for either of us lately. We have some friends that live in Staten Island that are Mets fans, and we've gone to 2 games up there with them, and we keep losing every time we go up there. So
we got third highest payroll in professional baseball and no product to show for it. And I'm going to guess you weren't alive the last time the Mets won it in '86. So it's been a painful drought for some of us.
True. Well, we have Dr. Hale on here because he has written a new book, as he just referenced. It is called Mending the Fracturing Church: How to Navigate Conflict and Build Trust for Thriving Communities. And I mentioned to him before we started here, I was a little nervous when I first got the email about the book, because I went, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship in North Carolina. I know. But I start doing some research, looking into it, and realize, this isn't quite the Baptist I grew up with in the IFB.
Yeah. No. Don't worry. I typically hesitate to introduce myself as a minister, let alone a Baptist minister, because it changes the conversation as soon as it says minister. But if I say Baptist, it really does change the conversation. And that's because for most of us, we assume there's one or two ways of being Baptist. But the great thing about being Baptist is we've learned to divide ourselves and subdivide ourselves so many times. There's literally thousands of Baptist denominations out there.
Right. And as soon as I started reading the book, I realized, this is going to be a little different. Not least of which because you start off with some Walking Dead references. There's some Star Wars in there. So I love that. But let's get talking about it here, because as we're saying, you have inhabited quite a few different worlds. You've worn a lot of hats. At what point did you realize that the fractures that we see in the American church needed a book-length response? like they're not just little disagreements, but actually systemic patterns that could use a book.
Yeah, so I've been serving in pastoral ministry really since I was 14 years old. And I've served in a lot of different types of congregations and a lot of different roles. And I don't care the shape, the size, the scope, or the format. Every church has something going on beneath the surface that needs to be addressed. And part of that is the church inherently is made up of human beings, and human beings are full of conflict and turmoil and differences of perspectives. But I will say that I was pastoring a new church start that was a very progressive expression. I pastored that church from 2010 to 2018. And we were experiencing a lot of people who were, the term we use now is deconstructing their evangelicalism, trying to find something different. I was kind of burgeoning in my more progressive worldview and was finding I wasn't being very pastoral to a lot of these people. I then shifted to what was said to be a progressive church in Louisiana, but was very much moderate right. And I was pastoring in the day and age, it's easy for us to say the day and age of Trump, but Trump is just a microcosm of where our politics are today. And I engaged a lot of people that, for right, wrong, or indifferent, had shared community with others, but were so easy to go at each other's throat. I share a story in the book that kind of really, to me, personifies this moment where I had a church member on Christmas Eve say Merry Christmas to me, but then quickly followed up with that she had her year-end contribution check in her pocket, and her brother, who's not a member but a doctor in town, also is bringing a check. So she didn't want to hear any of my flaming liberal Democratic And, I recognize that we're in a different day and age in which, while it's not just with ministers, and there used to be a certain level of respect and decorum between church members and ministers, but even just church people, and we're seeing our communities divide. And so I feel like there's so many books that have been written about how we are divided, but not a whole lot about what do we do about it. That's why I'm really trying to do the groundwork of creating tools for congregations to think about these things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The book was very practical all throughout. I thought any church member could pick this up and honestly probably improve just communication in their life in general, but certainly in the church as well. And like you're kind of pointing out, I think if you pulled any church member aside after a service on Sunday, they could tell you that the church is fractured right now. But at least in my circles that I grew up in the IFB, a lot of times it was, oh, well, it's because of worship styles. It's either not modern enough, it's too modern, or politics. You bring in the don't give us any of your liberal crap today. In your view, though, you go through several different, deeper root causes of these divisions. So obviously don't give the whole book away, but what are some of these main root causes that you think we're seeing here in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, we do have to name political ideologies and hot button theological issues are those things. But to me, those things are symptomatic of deeper issues going on. I talk about this in the book, that our congregations are becoming more homogeneous, and that is not a good thing. My friend Ryan Berg has done a lot of research and just had a book that just came out a month before mine, where he gives the statistical data around how evangelical congregations and white Catholic denominations are becoming more homogenous, and the fact that we are entering more and more into echo chambers. And at the same time, this is also happening in mainline denominations that tend to be more progressive. So what that means is that we are stretching out to our siloed tribes, and the middle, what we would use the language in Cooperative Baptist of being a purple church or purple denomination, moderate, are becoming fewer and fewer. And so what that means is that at the root of what the church identifies as is an echo chamber in which we are surrounding ourselves with people who look like us, who think like us, who merely reinforce what we want to already believe. And because what's being modeled for us, not just in politics, but you see this really everywhere you watch, whether it's a sports cast, where everyone seems to be arguing with each other, debating with each other. Everyone has to be right about something. And when we're not, we feel like the easiest thing for us to do is just to pack up shop and leave. And for many churches, especially if you're in the South like I am, Mid-Atlantic where you are, there are dozens upon dozens of options for you to go. For example, the town I live in now, gosh, there's maybe a couple thousand people. There's probably 30 churches in this town alone. So why not just leave and go somewhere else? And so, there's something that's going on that translates in from our personal lives into congregational lives that really is deeper than just identity politics or hot button theological issues. And really it's at the root of who we are as humanity and what our culture is saturated in right now.
Yeah, I had noticed that as well, because I actually came from a church that I would say was relatively diverse, especially for the IFB, a lot more than you would normally see. But as I got older, I realized any voices that were saying anything other than what you heard in the pulpit were getting quieter and quieter. And now that I'm more on the progressive side of Christianity, I see exactly what you were talking about. The fundamentalist pool is not just a conservative thing or a liberal thing. It's easy to say, "Oh, I'm tired of fighting with people on Facebook. I'm tired of arguing at Thanksgiving, so I'm just going to cut those people off and go hang out with the people who agree with me already."
In addition to that, I would say even progressives, and I call myself a recovering self-righteous progressive, is that progressives can also cannibalize themselves as well. That if one person speaks on something that doesn't seem to be PC, then all of a sudden everything about that individual needs to be written off, canceled and moved on from. And so, people are getting burned on both ends of the spectrum, which means that we're seeing more and more people that are leaving institutional faith and not returning back to it. And so that is a tremendous issue that we face today.
Oh, absolutely. I have a friend who also came from the IFB. He actually lives around Charlotte area, and he's trying to write and talk to people about having this in between space, being like a bridge builder between more
Mm.
progressives and conservatives. And in just like a year of writing about this and everything, he's telling me how exhausted he is already and feels like he's getting shot at from both sides.
Yeah,
Right?
it's hard. It's hard to fight the middle.
It is. One of the things I noticed as I was reading the book, and this really fascinated me, is how often fear came up describing church culture. Fear of people who are different than us, anxiety over becoming irrelevant in culture, concerns about change in the church. How do you think, from your experience, we can become less afraid and more curious and open, both as individuals and as churches?
Yes, yeah. So I want to be clear. We're not talking about a fear-based theology, but we're talking about the basic human function of fear. And really, what cognitive psychologists are looking at today is just how much our amygdala is being triggered by things that are happening around us. We are being reinforced for news. The vast majority of news is negative news,
Hmm.
fear-based news. Our politicians are constantly feeding us fearful news, whether from the right or from the left. And in addition to that, our communities are becoming more heterogeneous. For most people who live in metropolitan or suburban areas, there are more people in our neighborhoods who look different from us.
Yeah.
And so, if your worldview is very limited based on your experience and your education, if the community you have surrounded yourself with has been limited to people who look just like you, who function in life much like you, then there are so many aspects of other people that trigger a fear response in our brain. That fear
Hmm.
response is the same thing that our ancient ancestors had that protected them, that helped them find existence within a tribe. Tribe doesn't have to be an unhealthy thing. The
Sure.
problem is we're no longer, fending ourselves out in the wild, but we still have that same brain. And so our
Mm.
brain is constantly trying to understand the difference between how we love novelty, but also how we don't like novelty as well. And so, what is
Mm.
familiar to us and what is unfamiliar to us. And so, what's happening is that you enter into a congregation, you hear people speaking on different perspectives, you hear people coming from different walks of life. You hear a theological worldview that is much different than what you've heard before. And people are
Mm.
responding out of that fear. They're not recognizing it as fear, but that's when people become more hostile. They become more angry. They become more defensive. They tend to bully other people. That's when we really start to tribalize and isolate people who don't fit into the vast majority. And so for
Mhm.
many congregations, that's happening again and again. And so what I'm trying to do in the book, to kind of get to your question, is how do we become less afraid? How do we become more curious? Well, just
Yeah.
understanding that first and foremost is key. And so, two specific chapters I help with an assessment to help people understand what their trigger points are, but also understand what the emotional and mental triggers are happening within them, to understand impulsively what's happening within me. Why is my heart
Mm.
rate up? Why are my pupils dilating? Why is my stomach hurting? Fun fact for anybody who wants to walk away with something practical today: most of the times that you are nervous and your bowels are nervous before you do something big or encounter somebody who's so different from us, that's our
Mm.
ancient ancestors who are still living with their DNA, who wanted to flush your bowels in order to make you lighter, to protect yourself as you were going into battle. So you ever have to give
Funny.
that big speech and you feel like your stomach's hurting? Your ancient
Yeah.
body and ancient DNA is just trying to say you need to go to the bathroom before you actually go into battle. So what we're trying
That's
to do is
great.
just help us understand how our bodies work, help us understand how our brains work, help us understand how our emotions work, because in that and through that, we become more attuned to the person God has created us to be, that we are created with such a diversity of emotions
Mm.
and experiences and expressions. But it doesn't mean we have to give into those impulses. It doesn't mean we have to give into those things. And the more, not only can we understand ourselves, the more we can better approach other people. So instead of responding out of fear, we can respond out of curiosity.
Mm. So let's say someone is self-aware enough to realize, oh, I'm feeling some discomfort about this. I'm feeling a little aggravated. Could be something said in church or done, or you see a friend post something online and you start to feel that, like, oh, I got to respond to this right away. what would be a better course of action than what we normally do with responding right away? Like once you realize that and you're going, oh, something's triggering me a little bit here. Well, what should be the next thing someone does?
Well, that's where we get to the base level, why there's fracturing, because we
Mm.
live in a society where everybody has a soapbox, whether through social media, social media primarily, or within their congregations. That's a great thing about the free church, that the priesthood of all believers, in which all of us make up the body of Christ, right? We see that perspective. But that does not give us the right to write that damning post. I got more Monday morning emails and letters from parishioners over the years over something they didn't like in the sermon I wrote. And it's that impulse control to pay attention to what's happening, of why did this make me uncomfortable? What's happening in this dissonance within me? Why is it that I think that I am combating some sort of ancient heresy if I don't speak out against this? And honestly, when you look back at church history, you're like, oh, okay, some of the church leaders also didn't have impulse control as well, right?
Yeah.
Just read a little bit of the losers' history of the Council of Nicaea and find out what happened to all the Arians who didn't win that argument. Not a lot of them were living in the days and weeks and years after that experience. And why is that? What is it about our faith and our particular approach to faith that at times causes us to be so defensive, as if we don't say anything that God's self wouldn't be able to triumph over these things? And yet there are passages in scripture that remind us that, revenge and vengeance isn't ours to have, and it's that righteous indignation that ignites within us. And so, taking the time to take a beat, I don't think I actually put this into the book for editing purposes, but there's some simple methods that you can do as you're feeling your rage elevate, your heart rate elevate, certainly your breathing becoming more rapidly. So what we're talking about is the anxiety cycle in many of our lives, in which we start to feel anxious, and fear has an anxiety response to it. Change triggers that as well. Is that different things within your body are beginning to flow, specifically things like cortisol, which is a primary stress hormone. And for many of us, we don't ever flush that out of our system. And some of the healthy ways to flush that out of your system is to do vigorous exercise, things like sweating, even crying itself. Crying actually helps get rid of many of those toxins within our body, natural toxins within our body. So you don't have time to do those things. Sitting and flexing all of your muscles for as hard as you can for 30 seconds helps you get through that anxiety cycle. Practicing box breathing methods, where you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, pause for 4 seconds. Doing that several times, we start to find that our amygdala starts to say, I'm safe, I'm in a safe place. That those things alone can cause us to maybe rethink our response to someone, where I don't need to impulsively respond in this moment. I need to maybe give this a beat. I need to put relationship over rightness. But these are just some of the things that if we don't understand about ourselves, then we feel like I have to defend the cause, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this very psychologically informed approach that you're taking, because a lot of Christians that I know, and this is certainly true of me, we kind of have this like anything physical or embodied is bad because the spiritual's good, the physical's bad. And so we don't really know our own bodies. We're not in tune with those things. Just something as simple as a breathing exercise, that's basic, but it's not really taught to us because we're not worried about that. And so we just get stressed and it builds up. So how would this even look, applying this to a church as a whole, like taking this therapy informed framework that you're using? Like, how can we, as people who don't always have that ourselves, start to develop that as a group together?
Well, yeah. Well, we talk about this being, physiological, therapeutical, and things like that. But I also think it's quite biblical. You see the number of times that Jesus needed to pause and retreat. Jesus,
True.
100% God, 100% human, to be away from difficult people at times. One of my favorite passages comes from the Gospels. Off the top of my head, I believe it's Luke 9. Where Jesus commissions out the disciples. They come back. The Samaritan village has rejected them. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder, want to call down fire from heaven to the village.
Right.
And Jesus gives them a beat. He asked them to pause, and it says he rebukes them. what we're seeing is that even Jesus was trying to instill within them that discipleship isn't just about belief, but it's about full human embodiment. That the more we understand ourselves, the more faithful we are being to who God has called us to, the more effectively we can love our neighbor as ourselves. And so while for many of us in the free church, we have done spiritual practices, right? We do things like prayer, we do things like worship, but church tradition as a large, there are lots of spiritual practices that we can put into practice in order to more effectively become more attuned to our soul, to our heart, to our mind. I think it's not happenstance that, the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? What that tells us is that God understands the functionality of who we are as human beings to not just be soul-oriented people, that we have this body, we have this system, we have this heart, we have these lungs, we have this brain, and all of these things work in sync together. And when they're not, physiologically, that's when we begin to show different things. That's why they talk about that the effects of different types of emotional states have a physiological effect long-term on our bodies. That's why a lot of people, it's not out of diet, but it's out of other stress-related things. We have things like hypertension. We have bad sleeping patterns in our life. It's because we're given this incredible body. And so I think for churches is to begin to talk about that, to reframe our theological understanding of what we have in this vessel, what God has gifted us with. For those that love Paul's writing, we talk about putting on the full armor of God. I like to think that there's more than just spiritual implications there, but there's physiological implications there.
I love that. I think you gave us some sound bites right there. That's good preaching. I did want to pause for a second because I noticed you've mentioned free church a couple times, just as a term that I'm not sure everyone will be familiar with. So you mind giving a quick explanation of what's meant with that?
Yeah, sorry, church historian by 2 degrees. You start to think about the free church. A lot of people think post-Reformation. You have typically mainline denominations, but even mainline denominations, even Methodist, Presbyterian, there's some sort of hierarchy that has really a lot of say-so over the local congregation. So free churches, even within Baptist tradition, tend to be churches that the autonomy of that church, that individual church, to interpret scripture, interpret their beliefs, and put in those things into practice tend to be what we think of the free church tradition.
Perfect. Thank you. I want to talk about what was probably, I would say, my favorite chapter in the book, and it's toward the end. You're talking about generation gaps.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I found this one to be very informative and useful. So you're talking about how it often leads to miscommunication in churches. Why can't the youth just understand we've always done it that way? Why can't the old folks just realize it doesn't work anymore?
Yeah.
But you present this not as a threat to orthodoxy, but actually as a catalyst for deeper understanding, something we don't need to be afraid of. So how can we treat these generation gaps as something that we can lean into and learn from instead of being afraid of them?
Yeah, that's the chapter that begins with talking about the halftime Super Bowl show as a generational thing.
Yeah.
If I had printed that in 2026, if the manuscript wasn't due, that was 2 years removed. I could have said that it's actually a political dividing point, not necessarily a generational dividing point. But right. So that was, it's funny, is that was one of my favorite chapters to write about, primarily just because for really the last 15 years of my vocational career, I get asked so often and consult so often with congregations of how do we reach young people? And my typical response nowadays is, I don't think you actually want young people in your church, because if you want young people in your church, you're going to understand that they don't want to just be this idle generational group, as in not as in idle as in sitting still or worshiping this thing. I mean, like this group by which we covet. Generation more than any other generation before them wants to be a part of change now, and are not okay with told to wait their turn, and are not accepting that tradition trumps conviction. That's why you're seeing so many within Generation X and younger leaving the institutional church, but not leaving their faith. They overwhelmingly, Generation X and younger have a favorable view of Jesus of Nazareth. but an unfavorable view of the institutional church. And then the reasons they cite is a disconnect between the Jesus they see in the Gospels and the application of congregational life today.
Oh, yeah.
And that's hard for us to consider. And the other challenge that it comes with that is, and I work with congregations on this all the time, is the assumption that every generation that comes after them will be just like their generation, right? That you'll bring your kids to church, you'll volunteer in the children's ministry, you'll play your part, do the right things, your kids will behave in church. And that's just not the way things are. And so what I really wanted to help people understand is that there are tremendous generational gaps that exist, financial gaps, political gaps, ideological gaps. Those things are not just topics. They are major issues. If I recall correctly, and I won't get the percentage correctly, but the same home that was purchased in the 1960s that would have cost an individual $10,000, that same home today would cost over $1 million.
And, I wouldn't doubt it.
People, I hear it all the time. Why aren't young people contributing to the church? Well, first of all, they don't have as much disposable income as you do. Two, they're actually contributing to causes they're seeing make a difference in the world.
Yes.
And so what I want us to move out of assumptions about generations. And you can write dozens of books on this, and some great people have. I highly recommend you read anything from Kara Powell and Fuller Youth Institute, who've written a tremendous amount on younger generations and reaching younger generations. But it's not just about idolizing them. It's about how do we actually do this together? How do we understand that even if we can get young people into our congregations, or for younger congregations, if you can get older people, which is something I ran into as a church starter, we had 20, 30, 40 somethings, but 50, 60, 70 somethings wouldn't stick. And there was a reason why. How do we begin to understand each other, understand the different worldviews, understand the different experiences we were raised in, and come at that from an approach of empathy versus an approach of judgment? And I think that's where a lot of people fall short in that area.
Help me think this out a little bit here, because I have a thought as you're saying that, just of idolizing the young generation. And I see that a lot in churches where we say we have to reach the youth, or we have to reach the dads because then the whole family comes, or we need to reach more single people, or whatever it might be. And it almost seems like at that point you're objectifying people, you're flattening them, you're no longer, you're more concerned about the butts in the pews rather than the actual people. Is that a problem that churches should rethink how they're going after people, or am I reading a little bit too much into that, you think?
No, I mean, that's why I talked about the idolization of it. I'm thinking of Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that opening scene of going through all the difficulty of finding this idol that needs to be presented in a museum, ultimately for it to be stolen from him. And you think in the first place, well, you didn't even take it in the first place. All the hard work to go from it. But that is the case, that it is the desire for institutional perpetuation oftentimes that we have young people in our church. And so the fear of not having young people is that the institutional programming that we have created will no longer be sustainable. Yeah. And I think that can be a baseline fear for a lot of people. And so check your motivation. Why is it that you want young people in your church? Do you want young people in your church because you recognize that they have something to give to the kingdom of God, that their leadership matters, that you need to cultivate people of faith of all ages, that all of us, no matter our age or station of life, need healthy faith community within us? If that is your motivation, go right for it. But go with an open approach, go with an open ear, listen for the needs of people, understand that their systems and their schedules are going to be vastly different than any other generation before them. But if your desire is to merely maintain the look and feel of what you've always had, then you're just perpetuating a spiral of your institution that's going to lead to where it's going to lead to.
Yeah, good point. I'm just thinking too of how I don't know if this was ever stated. I have a degree in pastoral ministry from the Baptist college I went to, so I've read a lot of different pastoring books and how you structure churches and stuff, and it almost seems like the goal is, as the church gets bigger, you segment it out more into little divisions. Like if you just have one Sunday school class, the church is small, but when it gets big enough, then we have it separated by ages.
Mhm.
or when we have enough kids, then we have a junior church. But it seems like from some of what you're saying, we actually need to stop fragmenting that and bring the ages together. So is that always a bad thing? Is there a balance in how we share those together? Like where should a church be looking for that blending of the age groups and demographics?
Yeah, so that's ultimately kind of where I'm pointing people to in that chapter. The challenge is when my original manuscript for this book was 120,000 words, and I was tasked with getting it down to 60,000 words, is that you
Oh,
can write a whole book on intergenerational dynamics or generational gaps within the church. So what I try to do is address why this is a little bit deeper than just what we think it is. But then I start to look at what are the bodily benefits of living intergenerationally. And it is incredible from the youngest to the most seasoned among us that all of us have physiological benefits by being with people of different ages. You think about that. So for example, they've known that preschoolers who engage in diverse generations demonstrate improved socio-emotional outcomes, meaning they learn tolerance, they learn empathy, they learn social acceptance. And then you look at the oldest among us, you look at these studies, they found that it reduces social isolation, which we know is a leading cause of early death among senior adults. Improved quality of life, greater life satisfaction, stronger sense of purpose, all the way down to physiological things, better balance, better strength, walking speed. All of these things come out of spending time with people who are different ages from us. And so, yes, many of our congregations have made the mistake of creating silo-based aged ministry that typically happens in your spiritual formation or Sunday school hour, or whatever, small groups, community groups you have in people's homes. Most time is based on station of life. And then we think we're checking the intergenerational box by a 1 hour worship slot on Sunday morning.
Right.
We don't really do a whole lot of interaction. It's not happening by osmosis, by sitting in the same space together. And so what I would recommend for congregations is start small. Cultivate a space once a month that people within your church, no matter their age, can get together for a time of healthy community together. It could be doing a meal after worship on Sunday, but you've got to ask people and you've got to diversify the tables they sit with. You just have open-ended seating. Everybody's going to sit with their same small group. They always sit with their same family.
So true.
I give an example of the book of in sixth grade. This was 30 plus years ago, I was paired with Bill and Mary Lou Booth as prayer partners. And once a month at that time, they would send me a letter in the mail to name all the ways they had prayed for me in that last month. And Wednesday night suppers at church, they would sit with me and check in with me. On Sunday mornings, they would speak to me directly. 30 plus years later, they still reach out to me. Now, Bill died when I was writing this book, but Mary Lou still reaches out to me to let me know she's praying for me. What that shows is that over time, when we have that close connection with people within our congregation, you can begin to build these intergenerational pieces. Out of that, the informal and the formal, we begin to have a better understanding of each other. All of us benefit, both physiologically, but also socially speaking and theologically speaking, when we connect with people across all age groups.
I like that. It reminded me of when I was really little and I rarely sat at a kid's table. Like my parents always, had me sitting with the adults and just listening to the conversation, sometimes even interjecting into it as a kid. I think that actually helped me later on in life to feel more comfortable, voicing opinions that people may disagree with, or just listening to other people and communication skills. So it is really practical and helpful to have. It's not easy, but we need to be able to break out of what we're comfortable with and try to connect with people that aren't in the exact same stage of life that we are.
Yeah, we've got to give people the verbiage to be able to name what that dissonance and discomfort is that exists between the generations. I think I use a playful illustration of talking about all the different expressions of Batman that have been on TV or been on the silver screen in my lifetime.
Bale hardcore over here. I'm a millennial.
Yeah. I mean, but I'll go ahead and say I would have ended this call if you had said Ben Affleck was the greatest Batman.
Fair enough.
My pastor, my congregation, thinks he is. And that's, why our relationship is fracturing, continuing to this day. But so, yeah, it's funny when you think about those things. It's a helpful example. But for many people who, were raised in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you had this Adam West caricature, which was totally different than the Batman of the comics. But for generations, they assumed that this is what Batman was. And so that's why it was so controversial when Michael Keaton, a comedic actor, was, cast as this darker version of Batman. That all of us connect to things, whether it be Batman or music or politics or socio-economic things that are happening in our time. And the more we can begin to understand what those differences are, the more healthy our relationships will be of people from different generations. I will say, so I'm a Michael Keaton first, and then I'm 1000% a Christian Bale. I never thought I would love Robert Pattinson's Batman as much as I have. And I have been dying for that next film to come out. I'm going to say it. He's above Bale right now for me. I know that's controversial, but it's that good. It's that good.
I mean, he does deserve it. I think we can fight on it, but I don't know if I would entirely disagree. That was a great movie.
Yeah.
But I mean, I also grew up watching the 66 movie, constantly the Holy Polaris Batman.
Bats, what was it? The shark spray, the anti-shark spray.
Yeah, the bat shark repellent. Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
Yeah.
At one point in the book, you critique conflict avoidance. And that stood out to me because I catch myself leaning that way sometimes. Like, I'm more likely to keep quiet than voice opposition. I'll just go along with it. I might not agree with you out loud, but I'm also not disagreeing. I'm just letting it go. And it can feel like, oh, I'm the humble one here. I'm the bigger person. I'm not causing a stink. But you seem to suggest that can actually cause more harm than good when we just fade into ourselves and try to avoid conflict. So why is that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons all of us handle conflict the way that we do. It has a lot to do with our personality. It has a lot to do with our upbringing, our experience, our education, what was modeled to us. It has a lot to do with how others have responded to our conflict in the past. And so there's a lot going on underneath the surface. And so what I wanted to do in that particular chapter was help people understand, again, what's at the root of those things, that there are really healthy variety of styles of handling conflict, but then within those can it's all in the spectrum, right? That all of those things can turn unhealthy. So I'm a kind of person, I was raised let's just say it like it is. And I don't mean say it like it is, say it how I want.
Yes.
Speak directly instead of just sugarcoating it, instead of just flowering around it, just say how it is. And for a lot of people, that comes across as curt and rude and not compassionate. And so, the people I love most around me, understand where I'm coming from. And it's a learning curve for those that you work with, that can come across in different ways. So I had a situation in the last year where I was just speaking directly something, and I had somebody within our organization that came to me afterwards, and they're like, you were being so confrontational. I was like, how? Like, I named what it is that was happening in the moment. I'd rather, instead of us having 5 meetings where we had to dance around it, but they grew up in a family that avoided conflict at all costs. And so all of us handle it differently. And so, what did is I gave a personal assessment in there to begin to understand what it is and how it is that you typically handle conflict. We name both the healthy ways and the extremes that can happen within those ways to talk about. So we talk about aggressive dominance, winning at any cost, passive aggressiveness, conflict phobia. Those tend to be the 4 really extremes on the spectrum of handling those conflicts in a particular way. And we've all seen those before, right? And so there's not one way of handling conflict, but we also need to understand what's happening within our brain. We talked about cortisol earlier, norepinephrine. That's another neurotransmitter hormone that's taking place within our brain at the time. All of those things at times, both when depending on the severity of conflict, can cause us to respond in a variety of ways.
I wanted to ask here too, all throughout this book, we're talking about mending fractures. Is there ever a point where repair becomes futile? Like, is there ever a time where we should be asking, is it better to stay and mend or to release and replant something new? How do we determine that?
Yeah, I wanted to give a preference to almost every chapter with, yeah, but in these particular circumstances, you might want to think about
Yes.
that. You know, it is unfortunate, and it is a tale as old as time, that religion has been used by people who are powerful to control other people. It's a fact that
Mhm.
exists. Unfortunately, when you look at Christian history, all too often it has been weaponized for control and for power. And that doesn't change this day and age in which we live in which a lot of people are part of authoritarian expressions, that the theology is ruled by fear, by closed-mindedness, where the religiosity looks more like a political tribe than it does, the Jesus we see within the Gospels. We had a situation a couple weeks ago within our faith tradition in which one of our dually aligned churches, one of the female ministers on staff was bullied online by a group of people from a more conservative denomination about how dare this church have a female associate pastor on staff, right?
Of course.
And the question I asked online to response to that was, at what point do you start to ask yourself, do I look more like the Pharisees that Jesus combated in the Gospels than actual Jesus himself? And so the fact does exist that there are many faith traditions out there, that there is a certain level of toxicity that exists there where mending is not going to actually happen. You will not be allowed to do it. Doors are being closed there. And in those abusive spaces, I would say for many people that leaving might actually make more sense than staying, from a health standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint. At the same time, our culture has created this us versus them mentality. So those situations aside, right?
Sure.
Our culture has created this mentality of sides, right? Us versus them, this tribalistic perspectives. I said this near the beginning, that our congregations are becoming more homogenous and less heterogeneous. Heterogeneous congregations are congregations in which we embrace the diversity of perspectives and backgrounds by which people come from and are okay with that diversity. So our problem in American culture today, in American church today, is the statistics are trending towards our churches are becoming more echo chambers, meaning that we're not having space in which we can have open dialogue and agree to disagree on things. And because we want one way or the other, we want to be right, or we want to identify somebody's wrong because we're tribalistic. It's so easy just to pack up and leave and to go find another congregation. My friend I referenced earlier, Ryan Burge, wrote this book about how the dissolving of the moderate church is actually destroying American democracy as we know it, because we're finding fewer and fewer places in which we can surround ourselves with people who are different from us, and how we benefit from being with people who are different from us. And so I would caution people to first say, look at the context of the situation you're in. Again, an abusive situation, an authoritarian situation, you leave, feel free to leave. I'll help you pack your bags on the way out. Just give me your address. I'd be more than happy to help that. However, I would think we need to ask and question our motives, our approaches, our willingness to help cultivate those spaces for which we can find a theological diversity within our church, and both theologically but also politically diverse, so that we all can be more Christ-centric, and that the fact that the kingdom of God is diverse and is broad. And so that's why the only thing I would caution people on is to really look at that deeply.
What would you say then to someone who's maybe a little afraid of that? Like they see the ideal, but we have this culture of certainty in American evangelicalism where you have to know for sure on every little thing. You have to be right, and anyone that isn't is a danger to your faith. So I think that holds a lot of people back from what we're talking about here. So is there anything you would say to maybe help them allay some of those fears?
Yeah, start small. Start with a person in your congregation. What would it look like if you intentionally invited somebody in your congregation who maybe you're not combative with, but somebody, maybe I don't see eye to eye, get coffee or breakfast with that person. Try once a month, see what develops out of that. Start with a small group of people, a covenant together, and doing that to say, this is the purpose by which that we are doing this. I understand that it would be easy to surround ourselves with people who simply want to reinforce what I already want to believe, but I want to challenge myself to better understand you. Practice this in your own life outside of the congregation. Maybe those people at work, you get paid to be professional there. That might be a healthier place to practice it in, your neighborhood. We want to believe that these grand sweeping things is what changes, but what's really going to change our congregations is that grassroots relationships, which is ultimately what I'm pointing people to in this book, is to say the church at the end of the day is a relational organization. Yes, we have programs. Yes, we have this institutional monolith. Yes, we have budgets and bylaws, and we have all these things. But the church, at its most basic and a critical function, is a relationship. It's about building healthy community with other people. And finding ways to do that is going to ultimately lead to the thriving of your congregation. And oh, by the way, these are the problems you're going to run into along the way. But instead of avoiding them, figure them out and navigate them with other people. That's ultimately how we're going to see the church begin to thrive in America today.
So leaning into the differences, being willing to talk to the people that, like, it's almost like if you feel yourself shunning someone or pushing away, like that's the type of person to go meet up with.
Yeah. And I hear myself saying it, and I know, like, I don't want to go to talk to my neighbor who I know has that political flag, right?
Yeah,
I don't want to do it, right? And part of that is just, what is my end goal? I write about this earlier on in the book. One of the struggles, and again, this can be such a prophetic approach, but not a pastoral approach. But I really, at the end of the day, I love the church. But part of our struggle in the church today is that we have created a consumeristic society, a consumeristic culture within the church, in which our first inclination is, what am I getting out of it?
Yeah.
But our invitation from Jesus is to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Yes, we're called to love ourselves, but we're also called to love our neighbor. And so if our pursuit is in loving our neighbor and helping bring our neighbor to the feet of a God that lifts us up and empower us to become more than we think possible, then why not? Why not pursue these types of relationships?
Yeah. And not just to debate differences, but to actually learn, like to listen and be okay walking away with still disagreeing.
Yeah. And it's in that mutual sense of trust and respect that we can also push back, not to debate, but to be like, well, actually, like, that's factually incorrect. And like, I love you. And because I love you, I want to state that that's an assumption that you are perpetuating by doing that. When I talk about that, my favorite chapter I wrote about in the book was the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is political idolatry. And that we have a responsibility as followers of Christ to not be agents of misinformation. But out of that mutual sense of trust and respect, if we have that there, we're more likely to not perpetuate those things and to speak into each other's lives. But if we don't, we're more likely to debate and to argue and to isolate and to unfriend and to move on, which is easy to do today.
Yeah. This might be one of those, but I wanted to write a whole extra chapter about this. But I noticed that in a lot of the communication advice that was given, it kind of assumed equal position amongst the members of the church, or equal wrongness, if you will. One of the things we focus on every January, it's Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. And so we'll talk about some of the ways you can have spiritual abuse going on in church. So is there anything you would say a little bit differently if the harm is coming from the top? Like, how could you engage someone in power who's contributing to these fractures?
Yeah. That's what I talked about before. Unfortunately, some models of the church lend himself more than others to top-down types of leadership, right? The senior pastor. We had a mega church in North Carolina that will remain nameless, where this went viral years ago, where somebody took a picture of the coloring pages that were given out to children in children's church that said, God gave our pastor the vision for our church. It's like,
Oh,
I
nice.
don't think there's much room in that conversation to say, hey, you are perpetuating this toxicity. But that is honestly, and that's why it's you think of those types of things. That's the reason why people are leaving the church. The church and too many traditions have turned a blind eye to unhealthy and toxic behaviors that exist within a church. That's why there is misogyny and homophobia. That's why there's sexism. That's why there are sexual assault and sexual harassment cases that exist within congregations, because leadership was either turning a blind eye or leadership was not being held accountable for those things.
Yeah.
And that's just, we have to call a spade a spade. That's not all church traditions. That's not even the vast majority of church traditions. And so, how do you begin to get an inroad there? Well, the first thing is to simply try, right? To schedule a conversation and to try. And when that space isn't created, maybe bring a few others who are willing to try and to have that conversation. The hardest thing for authoritarian leadership is to be held accountable. And sometimes individuals are silenced. Sometimes large groups of people are silenced. And at that point, that's when you have to begin to ask yourself if it's better to leave than to stay. And I have a friend and colleague, Jay Keevy, who focuses on sexual abuse and prevention within our denomination. And, if you don't have somebody in your church tradition to do that, Jay is an incredible person. Reach out to him. Jay Keevy at CBF Global, he would love to talk about the dynamics and power dynamics and things that exist, how to approach those things in a healthy way that lead to change or lead to healthy departures.
Fascinating. Thank you. I'll put that as a recommended resource in the show notes.
Oh, he'll love me. Should I give out a cell phone number too?
Sure. Social security number you got? All right. All right. And I think now I need to cancel the order for the podcast coloring pages we were going to have next month. So gotta fix that. I hope I can get that deposit back. Toward the end of the book, I think it may have actually been the last chapter, you're suggesting kind of a shift in the center for churches, because a lot of times we define our unity around agreeing on these very specific doctrines, but you seem to suggest a different central point. So if not doctrinal uniformity, what should be anchoring our Christian communities?
Yeah, well, I think there's an inherent assumption that everything a church believes and has put onto their website is doctrine.
You're not wrong.
And that's the problem, is that we're arguing more about non-essential things than essential things that we have in common. And what I mean by essential things is there are two statements that tried and true, no matter what the church tradition was, have proven that across the time-space continuum that we agree on these things as core Christian doctrine, and that's the Apostle and Nicene Creed. Right. And outside of that, really, those become non-essential doctrinal matters that we have conflated to be more important than oftentimes those things. And I'm not trying to undermine, or I'm not trying to denigrate any faith tradition that values this particular thing. I'm not saying that, but the challenge we have today is that we're drawing more lines in the sand that Jesus himself drew.
Yes.
And you contextually look at the Gospels. When Jesus stepped into first century Palestine, he's not only combating against the religious hypocrisy of the day, but the religious hypocrisy that was not just undergirded by what we would perceive to be the Ten Commandments and the Levitical laws, but then there was commentary, thousands upon thousands of commentaries and laws upon those Levitical laws and upon those commandments. Those were the things that Jesus was constantly combating. The very thing that Jesus had this woman drugged before him. Very clearly, she has broken the commands. The law of Moses says that she must be stoned to death. And yet Jesus challenges their assumptions around those things, challenges their own sense of worthiness, their sense of sinfulness. And so I think that's an important thing for us to understand within our congregations today, that many of our denominations and many of our church expressions have cultivated belief systems in a fear response to something happening within our society. That A, do not fit within the Apostle and Nicene Creed, or B, is strictly based on a personal interpretation of the scriptures. And so I actually invite congregations to not loosen their doctrine in the sense of, move beyond those critical things, but let those things be the things that unite us and allow the diversity of perspectives we have to be something that we can celebrate as well. Paul talks about this in his letter to the Galatians when he talked about it in Christ. There is no slave, they're free, no male, no female, no Jew, nor Greek. What he's not saying is that, identity wise, we're all supposed to be a blank slate and just cookie cutter Christians.
Right.
What he's saying is that we all come from a diverse perspective. We all see things so differently. We all value things differently. And it is in Christ that we can find that unity. And so what I encourage congregations to do is to actually embrace that diversity, embrace the diversity of perspectives. The problem is that we've been told by denominations of faith traditions that certain people who have certain sins, who have certain things, are not welcome in our congregations. And we're living in a black and white world, which when you really investigate the scriptures, Jesus often invited people into the gray. How many times did Jesus respond to a question with a question, not with a definitive answer? And I think that's the Jesus-centric approach we need to take to the church today.
I agree. Absolutely. And if you have enjoyed listening to this conversation, I would recommend you pick up Andrew's book, Mending the Fractured Church. It should be available about a month now that it's been out. So anywhere books are sold, you can grab a copy. I enjoyed reading it. And Dr. Hale, it has been a pleasure to have this conversation with you here today. I want to give you the last minute. If you have any final thoughts for the listeners, any way they can contact you or anything you want to rep that you're working on.
Yeah, I would just say a lot of these conversations about the church, it can feel like just one big critique, but at the end of the day, I love the church, and it's because I love the church and I think the church has a bright future, and I think God has given us the church as this incredible gift in the world, and we have the responsibility of coming to it with depth and insight in incredible ways. So I get to practice this work every single day, and the good work that I'm invited into. If you want to find more about what I do, you can visit andrewrhale.com. It's a pretty static website, but it's got some information about some of the podcasts and things that I host. And yeah, I would love for you to pick up a copy of the book, give it to a friend. It's a great Easter gift, whatever holiday you need to celebrate, feel free to get one. But if I can help your congregation, more importantly, if I can help your congregation anyway, I'd love to.
Great.
Yeah. So I invite you folks to stay curious and keep asking questions about uncut and unfiltered faith.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.